Hello everybody. Today we'll be moving a little bit further into our discussions regarding a contemporary issue that is encountered in Indian society, and that is human dignity. If you remember, last week we spoke about the basic conception of human dignity, and today we'll be talking about the two biggest manifestations of the discussions on human dignity, which is euthanasia and manual scavenging. So before we begin, however, I would like to reiterate the fact that for the Indian independence movement, for our new nation, for our new constitution, perhaps the most fundamental objective was to secure a basic minimum standard of human dignity to all Indian citizens. And this is not surprising. For the makers of the constitution, the India they grew up in was significantly different from the India that we are growing up in. It was an India that was under 2 centuries of colonial rule, and one of the most fundamental logics of colonialism was to treat the natives as less than human, as subhuman, because this is what they used to justify the kind of brutalities that they inflicted upon their colonial properties. And this is essentially the kind of childhood that the makers of the constitution grew up in. So for them to live in a country which is founded on the ideals of liberty, justice, equality and fraternity, every citizen could expect to have a basic minimum standard of their human dignity guaranteed to them by law. However, of course, this was much easier said than done. It was easier to imprint in the constitution than to impact society. And this is because India inherited a deeply evilly stratified social order. Perhaps the most venomous of whose manifestations was the caste system, which was a hierarchical, originally occupational system of societal stratification, which then became intergenerational, which then prohibited social mobility. And this system essentially is premised upon the belief that some groups of individuals, because they are located lower on the hierarchy and that they are kept there by the rigidity of the caste system, these individuals did not deserve the entitlements that were guaranteed to them by the constitution. So this essentially is the story of how manual scavenging became so important to the conception of human dignity. Now there are a variety of different depictions of or definitions of manual scavenging. It has been prohibited in India first in 1993, then in 2013, and then there is a draft bill under discussion from 2020. But essentially it involves individuals picking up human excreta from various spaces, from dry latrines, most nefariously the Indian Railways, which still continues to employ the largest number of manual scavengers and continues to flout the existing legislations prohibiting the very same thing. And they then have to dispose this human excreta in various garbages or dustbins. They are also the ones who clean septic and sewer tanks. So it is a deeply hazardous occupation. It opens up individuals to the risk of cholera, to the risk of typhoid, various respiratory disorders, a lot of skin and blood disorders, and generally there are a huge rate of deaths. In fact, a report has found that most manual scavengers don't live beyond 35, thus depriving their family of their primary bread earners in most cases at a much earlier age. If we leave aside, and we shouldn't, but if we leave aside the hazardous implications of working in manual scavenging, one of the most problematic aspects of manual scavenging, perhaps the most problematic aspect, is that it is completely vandalistic to the conception of human dignity. It is based on the premise that some individuals are subhuman, and so that is why they will be cleaning other human beings' excreta. And this essentially was something that was essentially proliferated in 2020 when the Supreme Court absolutely clearly said that the continuation of manual scavenging and the fact that various state governments and legislative bodies and municipal bodies were continuing to flout the laws, which essentially penalized any agency or individual employing a manual scavenger, which completely proscribed manual scavenging and which caused or allowed for rehabilitation of manual scavengers or payment to be able to shift to alternative and better occupations. All of the fact that this is still continuing was absolutely contraventive to Article 21 of our Constitution, which guarantees the right to life and which also therefore contains the right to a life with dignity. The Supreme Court also emphasized upon Article 42 and Article 47 of our directive principles of state policy that compel the state to endeavor to guarantee to all citizens humane and just standards of working and a better standard of life. So essentially the only reason that manual scavenging is continuing, according to Bezwada Wilson, who is an important, very important activist in this regard, as well as the Safai Karmchari Union, which is another very important organization in this regard, which has been working tirelessly to eradicate this. They have fought a case in the Supreme Court leading to the very important Safai Karmchari verdict, which allowed the Supreme Court to, for the first time, absolutely ban any kind of manual scavenging. There are two reasons why this is happening. The first reason is that, according to Bezwada Wilson, it is because manual scavenging is so deeply ingrained into our caste system, and that has been the collective failure of the government, of the judiciary, even of human rights organizations to prevent this from happening. And because of the rigidity of the caste system, because of the fact that it is absolutely allergic to any kind of social mobility, any manual scavenger who perhaps in the age of information understands that this kind of employment is an absolute harassment of their human dignity, whenever they try to leave this kind of employment and seek employment elsewhere, there are upper castes who will tell them that no, this is your destiny, this is what you have to do. There are upper castes who will harass and threaten them to have to come to work. Perhaps one of the groups of people perhaps the worst affected from this are women, because there are significant gaps in government statistics about women manual scavengers, but independent research has found that 75% of manual scavengers today are women. So they may face lesser risks of deaths in sewer mines or sewer lines or septic tanks than men, but they also face the double burden of sexual harassment that they have to continually endure on a daily basis from a job that they just can't leave for a variety of reasons. This is on one side of the story. On the other side of the story, of course, that there has been a severe corruption of all government officials. From the UPA regime, Swachhata Abhiyans have been undertaken to essentially construct sanitary latrines or sanitary toilets, especially in rural areas, and to completely ban dry toilets which require manual scavenging. So whatever toilets have been constructed are of poor quality. They do not allow for mechanized cleaning. And a lot of times, because the bills on manual scavenging that were passed in 1993 and 2013, because they call for local bodies and municipal authorities to compile a list of identified manual scavengers, so as to basically allow them access to rehabilitation, because local bodies were hesitant to admit that they had the problem of manual scavenging, they left out a lot of groups of people from this definition. That is number one. The second thing that they did is that when people came to report their experiences as manual scavengers, they did not sign or they did not take those reports into account. So all of these problems have essentially led to the manual scavenging in India continually occurring still. And perhaps the basic problem here is that any law on manual scavenging, it accepts that manual scavenging is a harassment of human dignity, but it is difficult for that to be embedded into society. Perhaps one of the most unfortunate occurrences that have continued accompanying manual scavenging is that because of the pandemic, a lot of manual scavengers lost their jobs. So then they took to bone scavenging, which is essentially finding out human carcasses and disposing of them, either by selling them to factories who manufacture various chemicals or to medical colleges for their dissection purposes. And the most unfortunate thing here is that even after the pandemic is on the down now, there are still individuals who are continuing to scavenge for bones because, number one, a very lucrative black market economy has developed around it, especially in West Bengal. And number two, because they find this to be safer than manual scavenging, because there are more chances of death happening in sewers than there are in garbage piles. So this essentially is the entire story of how manual scavenging is an issue that is affecting contemporary Indian society and an issue that is very, very harassing of the dignity of an individual. Now, another different kind of story is that of euthanasia. Essentially, euthanasia, as we know, is a removal of life support. At least passive euthanasia, which has now been legalized in India, is a removal of life support from a patient who is in a persistent vegetative state, or a patient who is in absolutely a very, very ill condition from which they are in a lot of pain and from which they will never recover. So there has been a lot of discussions around euthanasia, and there have been various and very strong discussions around euthanasia, and there have been proponents and opponents on either sides. The proponents essentially believe that essentially euthanasia is important to guarantee a dignified death, because the right to life also contains the right to die, just like the right to speak contains the right to silence. So an individual who is in a traumatic condition that they have been suffering for years, for them a dignified and peaceful death is much more dignified than a death in which they waste away on a hospital bed. They also talk about the caregiver's burden, the individuals or their families that have to take care of them, the financial, the emotional, psychological and the physical labor that goes in it, and often that they are unable to afford it. For most petitions that are filed in the Supreme Court asking for euthanasia to be allowed is basically based on the fact that they are unable to afford it. So there had been the decriminalization or the efforts to decriminalize section 309 in our Indian Penal Code that essentially punishes anybody committing suicide. And then there were also efforts to essentially not look at euthanasia as suicide but as a medical intervention allowing the dignified end of life. Now on the other side of the story are individuals who believe that the right to life and the right to die are not coterminous. They are absolutely mutually exclusive, and the state's duty is to keep individuals alive. The physician's duty is a duty of care. So if you allow there to be a right to die or a right to allow for a peaceful death, it could form a very problematic situation in which end stage patients are not given palliative care and they are just taken and carted off to death. Essentially, this was their point, that there will be no amount of medical interventions for patients who may be cured but whose families would rather choose for whatever nefarious reasons to essentially end their life. So this is a debate on both sides of the euthanasia concept. The most important case here is the Aruna Schonberg versus Union of India, which was fought in 2011. So in the 1970s, and this is an extremely gruesome case, in the 1970s, Aruna Schonberg was working as a nurse in a hospital in Parel in Mumbai. And she was brutalized and raped and strangled by a sweeper that was working in the hospital, and the kind of asphyxiation that happened and the damage to the body that it caused, she lay in a vegetative state for several years until her friend Pinky Verma essentially used the next friend provision in our law to essentially fight her case and ask for euthanasia for her. Now the Supreme Court did not allow euthanasia in her case. And so she died just a few years ago after being in that condition in a coma for 46 years. So essentially, any conversations around human dignity or any conversations around euthanasia would essentially have to follow the basic fact that is the right to life coterminous with the right to die, or are they mutually exclusive to each other? And which of these options guarantees or goes the farthest in helping secure human dignity?